The invitation sat on the polished oak table like a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. A name embossed in gold foil glared back at him, his ex-fiancée's. She was marrying someone else, and not just someone else, but a man from the very same social circle that had once praised their engagement and whispered when it fell apart. The millionaire, Alexander, leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the untouched scotch in his glass. He had built his empire from the ground up, commanded boardrooms with confidence, yet somehow, the sting of that invitation cut deeper than any business betrayal ever had. His assistant had hesitated before handing it over, as though hoping he'd refuse to open it. But Alexander wasn't the kind of man who shied away from anything. If anything, he hated the idea of them, of her, believing he was broken, licking his wounds in silence. They expected him not to show, or if he did, to arrive alone, carrying the silent humiliation of rejection on his shoulders. That thought alone was enough to ignite something reckless inside him. Later that evening, as he sat in the quiet cafe down the street, a place he visited when he wanted to escape the noise of his social world, he noticed her. The waitress. She wasn't extraordinary by society's standards, but there was something magnetic about her. She moved with quick efficiency, balancing trays with ease, hair pulled back into a messy bun. What caught his attention wasn't her appearance but her attitude. She laughed easily with a child who spilled juice, rolled her eyes playfully at an older customer's complaint, and seemed utterly unbothered by anyone's opinion. When she finally approached his table with her notepad, she gave him a smile that was genuine, not the kind polished by ambition or pretense. "The usual, right?" she asked, tapping her pen against the pad. She remembered his order: black coffee, no sugar. Few people in his world remembered details without an agenda. "Yeah," he said slowly, studying her. "The usual." Then, almost without thinking, the words slipped out. "Tell me, do you own a dress?" She blinked, caught off guard. "A dress? For a wedding?" She gave a short laugh, a sound that was warm and incredulous at the same time. "That's a strange pickup line, even for a guy in an expensive suit." Alexander smirked, though there was no charm in his eyes, only a strange determination. "I'm serious. Would you go to one with me?" She tilted her head, narrowing her gaze as though trying to figure him out. Most men she encountered either flirted too hard or ignored her entirely. But this was different. There was no smoothness to his tone, just blunt honesty. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you don't belong in their world," he said simply, "and that's exactly what I need." Her brow furrowed. "That makes no sense." "It doesn't have to," he replied. "All you need to know is that I need someone fearless. Someone who doesn't care what anyone thinks." "That's you." She stared at him, torn between laughing at the absurdity and being intrigued by the challenge. No one had ever asked her something so outlandish before. A wedding with a stranger. A millionaire stranger, at that. Her instincts told her it was madness, but the spark in her chest told her it might also be the most interesting thing to ever happen to her. "You don't even know my name," she pointed out. "I'll learn it," he said. For a moment, she let the silence stretch, the clatter of dishes and low hum of conversation filling the gap. Finally, she gave a small, daring smile. "Fine, I'll go. But don't expect me to act like one of your polished socialites." "Good," Alexander said, leaning back in his chair, a rare grin tugging at his lips. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." As she walked away to put in his order, he realized the decision had already changed the game. He wasn't just bringing a date. He was bringing a storm. And for the first time since receiving that wretched invitation, he felt like he might actually look forward to the wedding. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of quiet anticipation. Alexander hadn't second-guessed his decision once, though his assistant had raised an eyebrow when he mentioned he would not be attending alone. "Who's the lucky lady?" she had asked, with a trace of hopeful curiosity. He had only smirked and replied, "You'll see." Meanwhile, Emily, the waitress whose life usually revolved around double shifts, coffee orders, and rent payments, found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror of a boutique she never imagined stepping into. Alexander had insisted on helping her prepare, but not in a controlling way. He simply wanted her to feel comfortable, confident, capable of walking into a room where all eyes would inevitably land on her. "Try this one," the stylist said, holding up a sleek navy dress that shimmered faintly under the lights. Emily hesitated. She had always been practical, the kind of woman who bought clothes that could withstand both work and laundry machines. This dress, however, looked like something out of a magazine, delicate, elegant, almost too beautiful to touch. Alexander, seated casually on a chair with the air of a man who'd been through countless fittings and galas, looked up from his phone. His gaze softened as it landed on her. "That's the one," he said firmly. She frowned. "You didn't even let me try it on yet. You don't need to. That's your color. It'll work." Rolling her eyes, Emily disappeared into the fitting room. Yet when she stepped out moments later, even she had to admit the dress transformed her. The fabric hugged her figure without being revealing, the cut elegant but not flashy. She looked like herself, but a version of herself she had never seen before. Alexander's eyes lingered on her longer than he intended. He wasn't a man easily caught off guard, but something about her made his chest tighten. She wasn't just pretty, she radiated something no designer gown could fake: authenticity. "You clean up well," he said finally, his voice carrying a trace of something deeper, though he quickly masked it with a smirk. Emily crossed her arms. "Don't get used to it. After this wedding, it's back to aprons and sneakers." He chuckled, but the thought unsettled him more than it should have. When the day of the wedding arrived, the air buzzed with whispers before Alexander and Emily even stepped into the hall. The venue was extravagant, crystal chandeliers glinting overhead, tables draped in ivory silk, every corner dripping with luxury. It was a world Emily had only seen in glossy magazines while sipping her break-time coffee. As they entered, conversations faltered. Heads turned. Alexander, dressed immaculately in a tailored black suit, carried his usual air of power and authority. But it was Emily who captured attention. Not because she fit the mold of the elite crowd, but because she didn't. Her confidence wasn't forced, it was raw and genuine, her smile unpolished yet radiant. "Who is she?" someone whispered. "Certainly not one of us," another muttered. The ex-fiancée, Clarissa, noticed immediately. She stood near the altar, radiant in her lace gown, but her composure cracked when her gaze landed on them. Her smile faltered just slightly, and in that small hesitation, Alexander found a flicker of satisfaction. Emily, however, felt the tension like a storm in the air. She leaned closer and whispered, "They're staring at me like I walked in here barefoot." "That's because you don't play their game," Alexander replied smoothly. "And that's why you'll win it." As they moved through the crowd, Emily's nerves settled. She spoke kindly to the servers, complimented the band, and even made a joke to one of the older guests who raised an eyebrow at her. To her surprise, some of them laughed, charmed by her lack of pretense. Alexander observed it all quietly, his admiration for her growing with every interaction. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about appearances, revenge, or reputation. He was simply present. And the irony wasn't lost on him. He had brought Emily to save face, but somehow she was saving far more than that. The reception hall glowed with golden light, champagne glasses clinking as laughter and polite conversation filled the space. Emily sat beside Alexander at a long, beautifully decorated table, trying to balance poise with authenticity. She had survived the initial wave of curious stares and murmurs, but she could still feel eyes on her, measuring, assessing, waiting for her to falter. Clarissa, the bride, moved gracefully among the guests, a flawless smile fixed on her lips. Every detail about her was perfect, from the delicate lace of her gown to the practiced tilt of her head when she greeted people. But when her eyes darted toward Alexander and Emily, the smile wavered. Emily caught it, just a flicker of irritation, and tucked that observation away. The evening wore on, and Emily began to relax. She joked with Alexander quietly, teased him when he looked too serious, and even managed to charm an older gentleman who had once been Alexander's mentor. People who initially doubted her began to warm up, but it was clear not everyone approved. A group of women at the far side of the table whispered behind manicured hands, sending her glances sharp enough to cut glass. It was during the toast that things shifted. Clarissa, holding her champagne flute high, addressed the crowd. Her words dripped with sugary sweetness, but her eyes gleamed with mischief. "Tonight is not only a celebration of love," she said, pausing dramatically, "but also of new beginnings. We all know how difficult it can be to let go of the past. Isn't that right, Alexander?" A ripple of laughter spread across the room, though it was the nervous kind that tried to disguise discomfort. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Clarissa wasn't done. "And of course," she continued, letting her gaze fall on Emily, "sometimes we all need distractions. It's admirable, really, when someone of Alexander's stature finds the time to give opportunities to those who would otherwise never step into a place like this." The crowd chuckled again, and this time the laughter was more pointed. Emily felt the sting immediately. She knew what Clarissa was doing, reducing her to a charity case, a temporary accessory, a nobody in a borrowed dress. Heat rushed to her cheeks, and for a moment, she considered shrinking into her seat. But then she caught Alexander's profile, calm, stoic, but with his hand clenched tightly around his glass. He wasn't going to respond, not here. So Emily did. She rose from her chair slowly, her voice cutting cleanly through the chatter. "That's a beautiful speech, Clarissa," she said, her tone calm but firm. The room fell into silence, all eyes snapping toward her. "But I couldn't help noticing something. You talk about new beginnings, yet you seem awfully preoccupied with the past." A murmur swept through the guests. Clarissa's smile froze, brittle around the edges. Emily pressed on. "I may not belong to your world of chandeliers and champagne, but I do know this: worth isn't measured by the dress you wear or the circles you stand in. It's measured by how you treat people. And from where I'm standing, I'd rather be the waitress with calloused hands than the bride who needs to belittle others to feel important." The silence was deafening, broken only by a sharp intake of breath from someone at the table. Then, unexpectedly, applause began. It started with the older gentleman Emily had spoken to earlier, and then others joined in. The clapping grew louder, genuine approval filling the room. Guests exchanged glances, some nodding, others smiling. Alexander looked at her with something close to awe. She hadn't just defended herself, she had shifted the entire atmosphere of the evening. Clarissa, on the other hand, stood frozen, her perfect smile cracked beyond repair. Emily sat back down, her heart racing, but her expression calm. She reached for her water glass and sipped, as though nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. Alexander leaned slightly closer, his voice low and filled with pride. "You realize you just turned her wedding into your stage, don't you?" Emily gave a small, wry smile. "Well, you told me not to play their game. I just made up my own." For the first time since receiving the dreaded invitation, Alexander felt truly free. And it wasn't because of appearances, or status, or revenge, it was because of the woman sitting beside him, who had reminded everyone in that glittering hall what dignity really looked like. The night had shifted in a way no one could have predicted. What was meant to be a flawless display of Clarissa's perfect new beginning had been pierced by a single, unpolished truth from Emily. Even hours later, as the band played on and the guests attempted to restore the flow of laughter and conversation, the atmosphere had changed. The bride smiled and danced, but the cracks in her composure were visible to anyone who cared to look. Alexander remained seated with Emily, though more people than ever came by to greet them. Some offered polite words, others offered genuine compliments. One woman leaned down to whisper to Emily, "That was brave. Refreshing, even. You're absolutely right." Emily smiled politely, though she could feel the weight of all the attention pressing down on her. By the time dessert was served, she leaned toward Alexander and murmured, "I think I've made enough waves for one night. Can we go?" He studied her for a moment, then gave a single nod. Rising together, they drew more stairs, but this time, the energy was different. It wasn't disbelief, it was curiosity, even respect. As they exited the hall, Clarissa's eyes followed them, her lips pressed tightly together. For the first time all evening, Alexander felt the scales had tipped, not because he had sought revenge, but because Emily had turned the spotlight into a mirror. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the scent of roses from the garden surrounding the venue. The quiet was a relief after the intensity of the reception. Emily let out a long sigh, leaning back against the sleek black car waiting for them. "Well," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "that was something." Alexander chuckled, slipping his hands into his pockets. "Something? You upended an entire wedding with a few sentences. I don't think I've seen anything quite like it." She shot him a sideways glance. "You're not mad I stole your thunder?" "Mad?" He shook his head, smiling faintly. "Emily, I brought you there because I thought you wouldn't care what they thought. I didn't expect you to remind me not to care either. You gave me something I couldn't have bought or planned." Her expression softened at the sincerity in his voice. "I just said what needed to be said. And you said it better than I ever could have." For a moment, silence stretched between them, charged and unspoken. The soft glow of the streetlights painted her features in a way that made her look both delicate and impossibly strong. Alexander found himself studying her, not as a stand-in date or a bold distraction, but as a woman who had managed to change the course of his evening, and perhaps his life. Emily broke the silence with a small laugh, shaking her head. "You know, I thought this would be one of those stories I'd tell my coworkers, you know, about the rich guy who dragged me to a fancy wedding just to make his ex jealous." I never imagined it would end like this. And how did it end? He asked quietly. She met his eyes, her voice steady. With me realizing that maybe you're not the man everyone else thinks you are. Alexander stepped closer, his gaze locked on hers. And who do you think I am? Her smile widened slightly, though her eyes held seriousness. Someone worth more than money, more than appearances. Someone real. The words hit him harder than he expected. For so long, he had been defined by wealth, by status, by the opinions of others. To be seen, not as Alexander the millionaire, but simply as a man, was more powerful than any triumph he'd ever achieved. He reached for her hand, surprising even himself. She didn't pull away. Instead, she laced her fingers through his, grounding him in a way no business deal or glamorous companion ever had. As the driver opened the car door, Alexander glanced back at the glittering venue. Once, he had dreaded this night, convinced it would be another scar on his pride. Now, walking away with Emily by his side, he realized it had become the start of something entirely new. They slid into the car, the city lights flashing past the window as the car pulled away. Emily rested her head against the seat, her hand still in his. Neither of them spoke, but the silence wasn't awkward. It was full, of possibility, of questions, of the quiet recognition that something had shifted between them. For Alexander, the wedding had closed one chapter. For Emily, it had opened a door to a world she never thought she'd touch. For both of them, it was no longer about appearances or revenge, it was about the unexpected chance of something real. And as the night stretched ahead, both of them knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning.